A comprehensive review of the medical literature finds that current gender transition policies are based on shaky foundations. More and more Americans report less sleep and more stress. And the Biden administration passes a bill to ban TikTok. Welcome to the Culture Translator Roundtable. I'm Evan Barber, and I'm here today with CJ Fant and Hannah Lane in the studio. Also beaming in from New York is Kate Watson. Great to be here with you all as usual. Wanted to share a little more encouragement to kick us off on a positive note this week from a user named Lovely Lady 1122. She writes, "This content breaks down what teens are talking about. That in itself is helpful, but then they take it a step further and share ideas for how to talk to teens about these things and how to open a spiritual conversation if possible. I'm a youth minister and a mom of a teen girl, and this is gold for me." Well, thank you, Lovely Lady 1122. You are why we do what we do, and we'll be doing more of the same in this episode. This week, instead of doing a song of the week or a slang of the week, we're highlighting a resource of the week, which is a recent course that we created called The Generosity Project. As we put it in the written Culture Translator, there are over 2,000 verses in the Bible about money, making it pretty clear that God really does care about how we treat our wealth and where we place it. But a true understanding of generosity extends beyond just our household budget. Access recently partnered with an organization called Heartwork to create this program, which we've called the Generosity Project. It can be used and processed in forms of a 7-day devotional, a 14-day, or a 21-day experience. And it's really about how we spend ourselves, how we spend our time, how we spend our money, and how we spend our attention. It's designed to help individuals, families, and youth groups explore the heart of God and the generosity that He invites us into. Again, with a pretty heavy emphasis on service and on spending ourselves in that way. CJ, I know you've talked a fair bit about how one of the main encouragements that you try to give students is you will find Jesus when you begin to serve in your local church context or in any kind of context.
Yeah, a lot of that is just, hey, volunteer your time, like be involved in what the church is doing.
Yeah.
Whether that's, hey, if you attend a youth group, just ask to run pro presenter or like help with the production.
Right.
Like, because they always need people back there. And it sounds very easy and very simple, and hilariously, a lot of students sit back there so they don't have to engage with the content sometimes. So as a leader, like you have to be aware of that.
So there are layers to it.
Yeah, there are layers to it. But I've found even those students who almost are like, I don't have to sit out and listen to the guy talking. It's actually like, I find that their heart changes over time. Sometimes you have to be like, hey, get off your phone. You need to hit the next slide. But for the most part, I've found that when you encourage students to invest in things, I think they find themselves as part of the kingdom of God. But then there's also a deeper level where obviously we want to make sure that we're not worshiping service to the Lord over the Lord, right? And I think Oswald Chambers talks about that a little bit a couple of times in My Utmost for His Highest, but which I always think about. But a lot of it is related to how do we encourage our students to buy into their faith? And I think one of the easiest and one of the most practical ways is to encourage them to serve somewhere, to give of themselves, to give of their time in a volunteer sense. And I think there's also great encouragements to have them start the process of giving monetarily and those sorts of things too. But I think any student can serve.
Yeah.
And that's super valuable.
Yeah. So this course that we've created, the Generosity Project, touches on all these things, but the scope is actually a little bigger. It's developing a heart of service in the place where you've been placed. And a lot of students have found it really powerful, and we're excited to make that available as well. So it's available on access.org. That's called the Generosity Project. All right, first thing from the top three, the CAS review, a comprehensive review of the medical literature surrounding transgender medical intervention for children and young people in the UK, has released its recommendations. The report concluded that there is conflicting evidence about youth gender medicine within the medical community, and that the science on the benefits of interventions like puberty blockers is far from settled. The CAS review pointed out that many of the existing studies that have been referenced in support of these kinds of interventions are of what they referred to as poor quality, which in this case simply means they don't present reliable indicators for providers to make particular care decisions based off of the evidence. The review's authors also write, for most young people, a medical pathway will not be the best way to manage their gender-related distress. For those young people for whom a medical pathway is clinically indicated, it is not enough to provide this without also addressing wider mental health and or psychosocially challenging problems. So it's kind of criticizing the mode of operations in some medical settings that would rush a young person who is expressing an experience of gender dysphoria straight into surgery, hormone therapy, puberty blockers, and so on. And it's saying we need to slow down on that, and we need to also include considerations around mental health and that sort of thing. Kate, help us understand and unpack this report a little bit, and help us understand what it might mean moving forward.
I'll try. This one falls into the bucket of stuff that teens are probably not talking about in the cafeteria, but stuff that is surely affecting the culture around them.
Right.
Yeah. So over the past, I would say 15, 20 years, I think most all of us listening, and certainly all of us in the studio, are aware that there's been controversy over how to treat gender dysphoria. This field has emerged called youth gender medicine. Youth gender medicine had to make some tough decisions about what interventions they would recommend for the many increased amount of people who are experiencing gender dysphoria. Since puberty blockers, puberty suppression, ultimate, what is called gender affirming care has emerged, people have been arguing over whether or not it really helps people who are experiencing gender dysphoria. And what this report from the CAS review concluded after analyzing a ton of the published medical literature is that let's be clear, not that none of this stuff works, just that we don't know if it works. And that's a really important distinguisher in medical literature. You're saying we don't know enough about this intervention to make a blanket recommendation, an evidence-based practice way of thinking about it. I don't really want to monologue here.
Sure.
But this was pretty controversial online. Some people criticized the data that the CAS report was looking at, saying that it wasn't, in terms of a systemic review, a strong one. I feel like that argument is a little bit weak, but that argument was there online. There were some people, particularly American journalists, who I think feel they've really dug themselves in this trench of, saying that this is settled science, and now the CAS review is contradicting that. They were pushing back pretty hard. But now even outlets like The Guardian are saying it's time to really look at this evidence, not in regards to how it shapes us culturally, but how it's impacting children medically.
So the shift that is kind of being represented here and criticized to some degree seems to be for a lot of, I guess you could call them gender activists, who might think that the best thing would be to get someone who asserts that they are a different gender than their biology indicates immediately into, some sort of physical surgery or hormone therapy or something like that. And that is just presented as a given. This review here is trying to apply a degree of scientific skepticism and hesitancy and an attempt to get at something closer to objectivity with like, no, there are a lot of claims that are being made about these practices are, of course, helpful. And this report is saying like, yeah, there's actually not really evidence to back that up and justify the degree of confidence that people have had that it would be helpful.
Yeah, from a purely...
I like that phrase, degree of confidence. I'm sorry, CJ, go on.
No, I'm just saying from a purely secular perspective, all science is assumed until it is not, right? That there's like, we do it one way and then someone's like, wait a minute, this might not be the best way. And then they either like come close to proving or show some data that shows, hey, this actually isn't the best way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how like the scientific community for thousands of years has refined what humanity believes at some point, that we're like, hey, like, I mean, famously like Eureka or Archimedes or, you know, all those sorts of things where it's just like, oh, this is the way the world is. And then someone comes along and says, it might seem that way, but it's actually not. And so just because it's related to maybe like something that has more social pressure on it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't say, hey, maybe we should think about this in a different way.
Right.
And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think at some point, if we say that everything we believe is unassailable, then we are fools, right?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, Kate, help us unpack a little bit of the criticism of this report is that it didn't appear to be thorough enough or scientific enough.
Well, I don't think anyone who's really looked at the sources that were used feels that it isn't thorough enough. I think the people who are criticizing this report just don't like what it says. I'd like to add some context here. Jesse Singal is a writer on this topic who has kind of been following the science from the beginning. And he has a piece in the Dispatch that just came out where he points out it's tempting kind of to think that the way the youth gender medicine debate has evolved is because there are these higher ups who want to enforce an agenda. Now, I can't prove whether there's an agenda or not, but I can say that there is something that's happened to the journalism industry where it's been at a time of transition for the past 5 to 7 years, a time when the industry can't afford to pay a lot of money to establish science journalists. So something that happened between 2015 and 2021 is that these outlets had to let go of established science journalists and instead employ these generalists and lifestyle writers and people who didn't necessarily have a long established background in writing about science, which is a hard and specialized beat. That meant that when they read studies or when they tried to apply scientific rigor to their reporting, they were just starting out. And also, a lot of them had sort of an activist bent because they were younger. They were a part of Gen Z. So I think a big part of what happened here was that we lost an entire generation of powerful and skeptical and rigorous science and medical and health journalists. They were replaced with people who you could say they had an agenda, but you could also just say that they were really green. And the barrier for entry for talking about these things is now very low. You don't have to prove yourself to be an expert. You just have to have a certain opinion. And I do think that all of those factors, the transition of journalism from the print to the digital model, has had a really negative impact on culturally understanding these things.
I think also maybe worth saying is, to me, I was thinking about, as I was reading this, the kind of distinguished history of psychology being tested on people. That's kind of, unlike other fields of science, you can't do any sort of psychological testing. I mean, you can, but not like intense psychological testing on non-human subjects. Mice don't have gender dysphoria. So you can't, measure the effects of hormone replacement therapy on a monkey or a rat or anything like that. So there is an element where the psychological science of gender medical changes is actively being tested on young people. And if you I think that's not something that you really hear a lot, but it is true that when you are saying puberty blockers help with mental health issues related to gender dysphoria, we don't have any way to test that, not in a general marketplace. So realistically, we're beta testing intense hormone therapy on like 11 and 12-year-olds, which is, it's funny. We look back to tests like the Stanford prison experiment and, still face experiments and the kind of maybe mid 20th century psychological experiments that we now look back on as being extremely unethical, but we also learned a lot from them, which is the ongoing conversation of psychology, right? Is like, what does ethics mean?
Yeah, right.
And I just wonder sometimes in, 50, 70 years, will they look back on this kind of treating very young children with mass market untested care, quote unquote? Will that be considered ethical? Is it ethical now? Will it be considered ethical going forward? I think something that was interesting is, and I feel like relevant to bring up, I spoke a little while ago with a young woman and her mother, and this young woman, she's 13, and when she was 11, she decided to transition to live as a boy and then has since detransitioned. And the experience that she shared was that as soon as she started wanting to use male pronouns and that kind of thing, immediately everyone around her was like, well, you should start getting on puberty blockers. You should get top surgery as soon as possible. You should start hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah.
And that was kind of pushed. And even as she was like, well, I don't know if this is something I want to do, the mindset that was kind of given to her and to her mom was like, well, try it out. If you don't like it, then, we can deal with that now. Like, let's jump on this now and see what happens. Which, jump on this permanent medical
right.
action.
Try surgery.
It's extremely difficult to reverse a lot of this surgery. And a lot of the surgery is permanent. I mean, if you get to a point where you're having top surgery, that's a really intense, invasive surgery. And the way that it was kind of marketed to her and her mom was, this is life-saving. She is on the brink of suicide. And if you don't give this to her, she's going to die. So do it real quick. Don't think too hard. It was turned into an emergency situation.
Right.
Which I think is, I think that's part of the tension here. And I feel this a little bit because we've been working on some stuff related to just the LGBTQ plus community. And there is almost an expectation that, hey, if you do not affirm how I'm feeling, then you are like hurting me essentially, or you are against me. And so that's like the tension a lot of the time. And obviously there is sometimes some mental health stuff that's happening there where it's like, hey, this person is contemplating suicide. And that obviously something is going wrong mentally for them, that there's this downturn or whatever it is. And so it's hard to know exactly what to do in those situations. But I do think there is a tension, I think, as Christians to affirm what God has designed, right? And that's really what it comes down to. But the two parties in the situation, if you talk about the Christian response and maybe the queer community's response, they're almost having different conversations. That one of them is like, hey, let's talk about what God designed. And the other one is saying, hey, this is really important to me and my identity and who I am as a human. Where sometimes I think those of us who maybe have never wrestled with gender dysphoria don't really realize that we don't think about our masculinity or our femininity as what makes us human, or who we're attracted to as what makes us human. And so sometimes the tension, I think, as Christians is to affirm the way God designed us, but also understand that when you don't affirm it, you are sometimes people feel like you're not affirming their humanity, that they're not a human, that, hey, this is what makes me feel human is when I can love the person that I feel like I should love, or be a man when I'm actually a woman, or whatever it is, And that's that. I'm not saying I agree with those perspectives from the queer community, but I am saying that is what they feel. And so you will feel that tension,
right? Even
with an 11-year-old who maybe can find a lot of information on TikTok about transitioning or whatever it is. And so they will start to hear those messages. And so if you're a caring adult and you're saying, hey, listen, the way that God designed you is not bad. It's actually really, really good. And for me, it's very important that we express different variations of femininity and masculinity. Kate and I were talking about this before this episode, just kind of randomly, that my sister sometimes is different than the other women, and it's like she's a go-getter, and like sometimes has like these. Sorry, I have to be very careful about what I say here. Sometimes is less traditional feminine, and sometimes I'm less traditional masculine. But the reality is I'm still a guy and she's still a girl, and those are both super valuable, and we don't want to like pigeonhole people into specific types of.
We don't want to build
gender
ideas
expression
around maleness and femaleness around stereotypes is what I hear you saying.
And
there.
also that aren't biblical.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, to be a dude, you need to be Rambo.
Oh,
and
right.
That's, I don't really think that's biblical.
Well,
I think there's warriors in the Bible.
Totally.
And those are valuable stories and important men.
I feel like what's at issue here is really that there are just two pretty fundamentally different worldviews that are bumping up against each other.
Well, it reminds me of...
And let me go for a second.
Yeah.
Part of what makes Christianity unique is its emphasis on the goodness of the body and on the goodness of embodiment.
Yeah.
Right? And we've talked to this podcast several times before about how many other faiths and worldviews tend to emphasize the spiritual maybe as an escape from this world, right? Some people have argued that the sort of transgender ideology is kind of a modern remix of the heresy of Gnosticism, right?
Yeah.
That the early Christians confronted, which was basically the belief that Jesus could not have been in a body because bodies are inherently like bad. They're not us. They're not who we are.
But bodies are gross.
Yeah,
that's Gnosticism in a nutshell.
Essentially, yeah.
Actually, Evan, I think that was so interesting. Neo-Gnosticism was exactly the word that was on my mind. I think in a lot of ways, our culture kind of has set up the pins of what has become the transgender movement, knocking them down. Like, this hasn't come out of nowhere. For more information, check out Carl R. Truman's fantastic book, The Rise and Triumph.
Hannah's favorite book
my favorite
of all
book.
time.
I do think there is an interesting element where over the last century, more than a century, we've set up the human body as something very plastic. And even within, Christianity, this sort of mind-body dualism has definitely been a part of our faith's evolution. And this kind of concept of like, well, the flesh versus the spirit, the flesh is bad and gross and sinful and icky, can't wait to go get a new perfect body. And that's just Gnosticism repackaged. Our bodies, though broken by sin, are still valuable.
And still designed by God.
By God. Yeah. And so this
Imago Dei and all that stuff.
Yeah. So. This actually in a lot of ways, it's a little reminiscent of, Stoicism versus hedonism, which is Greek and before, ancient Greek. But this kind of
Greek and
before. That's how I refer to history.
The two ancient time ranges.
Yes.
Greek and other.
Who cares about the Bronze Age? It's just, were the Greeks there yet? Yeah. No? All right.
That's it. Everything else is nonsense. I don't stand by that. I'm kidding. But there is this kind of, this weird, I think both Christians and secularists have set up this kind of like, the body does not matter, the spirit does.
Right.
The Christian framing of that has been, so get rid of the body, but then the secular framing has been, well, so do with the body what makes you feel good.
Exactly. You're so right, and I'm so glad that you pointed that out. And I think that even plays in some ways to some conversations that we have around like, what's the real you is who you are on the inside. What matters is on the inside, right? And there are elements of that are like, kind of true, but again, part of the uniqueness of Christianity is God came in a physical body. Resurrection is the hope, not just reincarnation or spiritual heaven disembodiment and so on.
I think it is. I want to clarify. I would argue, and maybe we disagree as a table on this, but I would argue that it is more the rise of the mental state, not the spiritual state, that is informing transgenderism.
Okay.
How do you feel? And it's the emotional, which is a tiny bit different than Gnosticism because there's less spiritual conversation around it.
Yeah, I see that.
But I would also emphasize that, like, hey, Christianity cares about the mental state and the spiritual state, and it's not like, hey, physical above all else. I think that's where you get into problems is when you say, well, however you feel and like mentally how you feel, well, that's the truth. And that's a lot of the argument behind transgenderism is you have a physical reality and a mental reality, right? And the mental reality says, I feel like I'm a woman, but the physical reality says, I am a man, right? And
So
there's
then,
an overemphasizing on, hey, well, the physical reality should follow the mental reality.
right.
Carl R. Truman talks about
Well,
this in depth. And so,
Yeah, Kate.
I would like to use that to segue into talking about the findings of the CAS review a little bit. Something they concluded was that anyone who's experiencing gender dysphoria really needs to be walking through a psychological, mental health, as well as medically informed journey. I never want anybody listening, especially a parent, to feel like we're talking about this stuff as just dispassionate observers. I mean, the fact is, if you are a parent to a child who is experiencing gender distress and you're looking at the CAS report, wondering if your child will be able to even access any type of gender care, affirming or otherwise, I think that's probably frightening. I think that kids who are currently on puberty suppressing medication may be feeling frightened as well, wondering, I was told this is safe, is it not? Wondering, I was told that I need this, will I not be able to have it? I think that those practical implications are easy to overlook when we talk about the overarching big plan, which obviously has incredible ramifications. I'm not trying to downplay that, but I do feel like for parents who are in the trenches with this, it's hard.
I think that's
so
really
hard.
That's so important to point out, Kate. And I think actually maybe to draw on something from the young woman and her mom I talked about recently, something they said was like, we've been in family therapy this whole time. They were not like, well, let's just, let it play out, keep everything at arm's length and just let things happen. I think the very real, like, you can talk about the philosophical like implications of neo-Gnosticism all day, and they're important and there's space for that. But in the real day-to-day, it's like, well, how do I get through the day? If my kid is suicidal, how do I keep my kid alive? I think it is really important. I'm glad that you mentioned that, Kate, that empathy and that compassion from parent to child, from society to family, like that's missing in a lot of these conversations. And I'm glad that you made sure we highlight it here.
Yeah, I guess what I hear you both doing here is humanizing the people who are in the midst of wrestling with these sorts of dynamics and tensions. And that, even if, a historical Christian worldview might disagree with the way that gender services are being administered in the modern era, I think that there has been a tendency, and maybe this is what you were trying to push back against a little bit, to say, those people are the enemy, right? And I think even there's maybe a different conversation between someone who's experiencing gender dysphoria and the sort of cloud of voices around that person who say, the thing you feel inside is the truest thing about you. Whereas I think what we're trying to say here is our mental state is important, our emotional state is important. It doesn't make it more important than our physical reality, right? Yeah. And that there's like a mind, body, spirit aspect to the identity that God has created for us.
I think there's a balance. And I think one of my fears about the Christian response is to overvalue the physical reality and not try to care for the mental, that mental reality as well. And like speak into that as well. And so I just think, I think it's a human tendency to overemphasize one thing over the other. Totally. And I just think that's true in almost all spaces, whether it's culture or whatever it is, where there's always this pendulum that's swinging that says, hey, like whatever makes you feel good physically, and then suddenly it's swinging back to whatever makes you feel good mentally, or whatever that is, and there's so many different things there. So yeah.
Well, Kate, maybe first off, let me know if I represented what you were trying to convey in an accurate manner, or if there's anything that you would add to that. And then if a parent wanted to start a conversation about these topics, where do you think would be a good place to start?
Man, this is such a heavy one.
It is.
I think we need to remember that there's bunch of people receiving this information about the cast report. And I think that if you are someone who is immersed in a community where the biblical worldview is the norm, the temptation is to say, look at this report. It proves we were right. And lean right into that, crow about it, feel justified. But Jesus warns us about feeling overly confident in our justification. And I think it's important to remember that the report actually isn't saying that. It's saying, we don't know what we don't know. Time to find out. That in itself is something we should all celebrate. There's also a segment of population who's receiving the news in this report, and it is distressing. It is confusing. It is counterindicative to what mental health professionals and doctors have told them, and it is a lot to wrap your head around. So when we have conversations with people about this, I think that those things should be top of mind. I don't know if your teenager wants to talk about the cast report, but maybe they might want to talk about what's a good way to find news. What's a trustworthy way to find news? Like, a huge percentage of Gen Z gets their news off of TikTok, which we'll talk about later. And, you know, that's just different news. I'm not even going to say that that news is lower quality than other places that lots of people get their news. I'm just going to say that conversations about where you get your information are important to have for media literacy. And also, it's more fun to talk about than the cast report.
All right, next up, Gallup polling data has found a huge spike in the percentage of Americans who say they get less sleep than they need. Survey results also indicate an increase in Americans' daily stress. The data indicates that when you interact with anyone, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, there's a good chance that person is feeling both exhausted and stressed out. It's they found especially true for young women between the ages of 18 and 29. In 2001, 42% of young women in that age bracket said that they felt like they did get enough sleep, and that number has now dropped to 27%. So younger women are also the most likely to say they experience daily stress. So Hannah, let's start with you on this one. What do you attribute this lack of sleep to, and why is it social media?
How dare you say exactly what I was going to say? Yeah, I think I found this really interesting. I think maybe I was more shocked that in 2009, so many people were like, yeah, I get enough sleep. I was not sleeping in 2009, but I also have.
Yeah, 2001, I think, was the
2001?
the bracket age, but
2001.
I was sleeping
Yeah.
in 2001. I was 4. So it was a good time for me.
yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, I think it's interesting. It also makes so much sense that people just like sleep less. I mean, just structurally, blue light from our smartphones, it keeps us awake.
Yeah.
Period. That's true. That's evidentiary. If you have a smartphone, you will not get sleepy in the same way. And then you have just, from a historical perspective, since the Industrial Revolution, people's sleep cycles have been changing. I won't get into biphasic sleep now, but biphasic sleep is when people would sleep a little, wake up, do some stuff, go back to sleep. And I think we should bring it back.
I think we should bring it back.
Yeah. But it was, people would rise and, go to bed with the sun for a long time. The Industrial Revolution introduced electric light in personal residences. And so things like candles, which aren't going to necessarily keep you up, and like the moon were no longer how people determined when they were sleeping and when they were awake and how light operated. So we've just like turned that up by a million, because even without smartphones, we have light pollution. We have more people living in urban areas. And so noises like cars and people and all the kinds of sounds that come with an urban environment are there. We just are not in a world that is friendly to deep natural circadian rhythms. I think the other part of this is more cultural and psychological. And this commitment to, this is my hot take. This is my thesis. So this is the one that we're going to fight about, maybe.
Oh, okay. Bring it on.
I think that our Western emphasis on hyperproductivity at all times is a mindset that is inherently opposed to getting enough sleep.
Totally. I will not fight you whatsoever.
Oh, good. Awesome. Evan's on my side. Yeah, no.
I mean, if you're sleeping, you're not being productive technically.
Exactly. Yeah. Like,
and I say technically because I actually think that's not true, but
yeah.
Because I think sleep is very important to productivity.
The brain is sorting the memories, and that's a type of productivity.
Yeah.
Well, also just like being rested helps you work better.
Sure.
I always would tell people, and a piece of advice I give to a lot of high school seniors is, hey, when you go to college, do not pull all-nighters. Just go to bed.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Finish your thought, though, Hannah.
Oh, yeah. No. I think that's a really good point. We've equated productivity with actual production.
Mm-hmm.
Or how many hours of the day are you making or doing something? Are you growing and changing? Are you, is there something measurable?
Yeah.
And if you are asleep, you really can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've struggled with insomnia on and off for most of my life. And this January, I had a really, really bad week. And I was awake at like 4 a.m. one night. And I was like, I am going to be so miserable tomorrow. Isn't it crazy that how happy I am depends on how long I was unconscious?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just
a
funny.
Weird, yeah.
Yeah. And
it's a weird thing we do.
Like realistically, if it were possible to just never sleep, I think there's a decent amount of people in the culture right now that would absolutely choose that.
Right.
Because our culture of productivity would reward people
Totally.
who never slept. I mean, even I think if you ask the average person how they're doing and they responded, I'm actually super great. I sleep 9 hours a night regularly. I'm super happy. I have one thing on my plate every day. I'm never busy and I enjoy my life. If I heard that, I feel like I'd be a little mad. I'd be like, how? Like, what the heck? How did you do that? How do you give me your wisdom? I'd be jealous because I feel like the standard mode of operation for people, and I felt this since high school, is that there's a kind of a badge of honor to be like, oh, I'm busy and exhausted. I'm so tired. I never sleep enough because I'm always doing something. I'm always on my grind. And I think that's really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's super opposite to the way that we're designed. And I think it is I think the less we sleep, the more we're destroying not only our mental health, but our ability to appreciate beauty and to form healthy relationships.
Totally.
My hot take.
I know that John Mark Comer, who has written a lot about spiritual disciplines and so on, traditionally slowing down was not thought of as a spiritual discipline, but he is kind of arguing alongside solitude, alongside prayer, alongside worship, we should have slowing down, because that is a really important need/thing that will help people connect with the Lord on a deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, just I think there is nothing greater to our holistic health, physical, mental, spiritual, all that stuff than sleep. Like you follow any dude who is an influencer focused on working out and getting gains and building up your body, and they will always say, hey, two most important things are to stay hydrated and to sleep, because that's when our muscles repair themselves. And so all of those things, it's so funny. We have this, I agree with Hannah. I think we have this culture that says, hey, the more you do, the more valuable you are. But then there's also all of these things that are like, hey, for your mental health, it's better to get sleep. And for your physical health, it's better to get sleep. And you should spend time unconscious, not doing anything, not being quote unquote productive or whatever it is. And I just find that pretty hilarious, in terms of just not hilarious, but it's ironic that it's like
not funny, haha, funny, weird.
Yeah, there are these such conflicting messages.
Yeah, right.
But to me, I think there is like an obviousness to which one is probably more true. That hey, we should be spending more time in rest, and I think we should be spending more time in rest that's not sleep, and also more time in rest that is sleep. That being said, I probably don't get enough sleep. And I think want to talk about like conversation starters, like 3/4 of women between 18 and 27 aren't getting enough sleep. Hey, how's your sleep been? Boom. let's
Start
talk
that
about
conversation.
it. Right. And
Yeah.
also kind of unnerving that it's like, man, 3/4 of the women you talk to are like miserable because they're not getting enough sleep. Maybe not miserable, but
Well,
just
stress.
think about that,
yeah,
right?
I mean, something else that the Gallup article points out, and then I'd love to kick it to Kate and get her thoughts as well. This is from the article. Research on health and wellness show a strong connection between stress and sleep quality. According to the American Psychological Association, the relationship between sleep and stress goes both ways.
Yeah.
Those who sleep less are more stressed, and those who are more stressed sleep less.
I realize 18 to 27 for women is when you have small kids usually. Like far and above. I mean, it's probably a little
Is it,
older
though?
now.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
like,
I feel like
Not
I feel
in New York City, baby.
Yeah.
yeah, I feel
Yeah.
like
Not in my life.
yeah, I feel like the number has gone up a bit.
Personally.
yeah, for
Um,
sure. I mean, I think age of marriage is like 28 for women, I think now, but that doesn't correlate with age of first kid, just to be clear.
That there are wrinkles and nuances there.
Yeah.
Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you make of this sleep research?
Do you sleep?
And do you sleep?
We will leave the question of my sleep a mystery.
Dang it.
You could probably, if you're watching this, look at me and know the answer.
No.
I'm going to say that kids need more sleep than adults.
Mhm.
The way that this survey was phrased was, do you feel like you get enough sleep?
Hmm.
So then there's two things balancing off each other. One, someone's idea of how much sleep they need, which most likely doesn't add up to any sort of medical recommendation. It's just like this, nebulous thing, like, do I get enough sleep? The other thing is, how actually do we determine how much sleep we need to regenerate? Like, that seems like kind of weird territory. But in any case, how this relates to parents, how this relates to teenagers and their relationships is, if you are a parent and you get 7 hours of sleep, that is supposedly adequate for you. If you are a teen and you get something like 7 hours of sleep, you are going to end up in some tremendous sleep debt. And that applies to adolescent boys and adolescent girls. I think they've done some research to show that adolescent boys, their circadian rhythm is set so that they would ideally wake up a little bit later in the mornings. And the entire school system and extracurricular sports and extracurricular other things are set to disrupt that.
Mm-hmm.
So to actually get the amount of sleep you need, you have to be in active combat with the other obligations in your life to make sure that you can get that. And like, that's really hard and confusing when you're a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention the sort of cultural pressures that surround, so many teens of like, you have to maximize your number of extracurriculars so that your, college application looks amazing.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah, something that I've seen a lot on social media is this idea of revenge procrastination is the term that's used. This idea of, well, I am getting back at this day that was way too full by staying up late and having a peaceful evening. This kind of
doing what you want to do instead of an obligation.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, well, I'm forced to go to school or go to work or have this or that responsibility. And so now I'm going to seize this time to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
Which is so great in theory, and in practice, it's really bad for you. And I do this. I feel this. As an adult, the kind of like, well, now I'm alone, and so I can enjoy my time alone, and I can have the freedom to structure that time however I want. But why does that time have to be super late at night? And I think there's also an element of something that I've heard a lot that I think is an indicator of unhealth and how we structure our days is, well, I don't want to go to sleep because once I go to sleep, then I have to wake up and face the next day. And if
That is so sad.
isn't
Yeah,
that
that's-
so sad?
That's pretty-
So I was waxing poetic on my Instagram about this the other day. I am terrible at getting up in the morning. I have always had to trick myself using elaborate tools and traps to get myself out of bed and then stay out of bed.
Does Kenny throw water at you in the morning?
Not anymore. No, I don't think he ever did that. But I did used to lock my alarm in a little safe, and then I'd put the key like in another room in my coffee cup on the Keurig. So to turn off my alarm, I had to go make coffee and retrieve the key. It's like a puzzle
How did we
every
not-
morning.
When we
I-
did the deep dive on free run, how did we not talk about how she's just you?
Oh my gosh,
Sorry,
you're so right.
we watched a thing for another podcast, and the main character of the podcast does not wake up. Like, it becomes the arc of an episode where
It's
she just
true.
cannot wake up for anything, and she just always falls asleep.
And
That's
Yeah.
me.
turns out it's Hannah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
me. But I think. Oh my gosh, I totally lost my.
I'm sorry.
So you set up a Rube Goldberg machine.
I set up a
to-
Rube Goldberg machine. No, but something I've been doing recently is after the Rube Goldberg, I get my coffee, and instead of being like, okay, now I'm going to work out or like be super productive, I've just been going right back to bed. I sit in my bed. I don't, lay down, but I drink my coffee in my cozy warm bed. And honestly, it has really revolutionized the way that I think about my own mornings.
Mhm.
Because I think I fall into that productivity trap really easily of like, well, okay, I didn't get up early enough and I didn't do my routine and I didn't work out. And then even taking in that spiritual guilt of like, and then I didn't have a very long quiet time. And oh my gosh, I prioritized doing my makeup over spending time with God. I'm a horrible person. And I know that I'm not the only person with that anxiety spiral. So that's why I mention it.
Mhm.
But it's been really important to me to say like, well, the first thing I actually want to do with my day is rest. And it's a concept that I have heard, I think, a lot. And it's a really biblical concept, obviously, that God rested. That is part of his creative process.
Good.
But something that a speaker spoke to us about at Axis not too terribly long ago was this idea that the first thing humans did upon being creative was sleep. That Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day, and then it was evening, and then morning, and then the day of rest. And
Yeah.
I just found that so beautiful that
Right.
our very first act ordained by God as creative beings was going to bed.
Mhm.
And like what an act of worship it is to sleep. That I've just been thinking about that so much that being asleep in front of someone is such a vulnerable, trusting act. It's why it's so important that married couples sleep together, that you are vulnerable in front of this person who is the person who you're supposed to be able to trust the most. That when kids are scared, they go sleep in their parents' bed. That sleeping is such this, like, I if I'm sleeping in front of you, I trust you with my life. And to sleep and choose to sleep under the watch of God is such an act of trust and vulnerability.
Yeah. Wow.
And if we think of sleep in terms of something productive, of I have to get these many hours so I can do all these things, we're sacrificing that actual rest and that choice to be vulnerable and to commit our sleeping safety to a Lord who cares.
Yeah, and it's like a form of surrender in some ways.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
hey, I'm not self-sufficient. I'm limited. I'm finite, and I'm going to acknowledge that by submitting to the design that we have as humans, which is like we have to spend a third of our life laying down horizontal with our eyes closed.
Yep,
which is still very strange.
Hallucinating vividly.
Yeah, right.
Controlling nothing.
It's one of the most mysterious things ever.
Speak for yourself. I plan on being that old guy who falls asleep in chairs all the time. So there's like a vertical component.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good.
It's
I can
like-
see you being that guy.
Listen, that was about my grandfather, and I respected that a lot. He'd just be like, oh, hey, granddaddy's asleep again.
He's out.
My
There we
dad
go.
does do that. Calling out my dad. He's the
that's
guy.
it.
He'll be asleep, and you're like, Dad. And he's like, I'm not sleeping.
It's a guy thing. It's definitely like a grandpa,
Yeah.
old man thing,
Yeah.
which I
And,
love.
you've earned the right at that point.
Yeah.
Just dozing
Just
off on a chair.
Forget it.
Just put on the football game and
See ya.
Take a
Bye.
little nap.
Hannah, the topic of sleep, there are a lot of different directions that could go. I appreciate Kate bringing up the fact that teens need a lot of sleep.
Mhm.
We all need a lot of sleep. We live in a culture that doesn't support that necessarily, but there's a spiritual design
Mhm.
to the need for sleep. What's a way into some of these conversations about this weird going unconscious thing that we
Yeah.
do?
Well, we already said the question is, do you feel like you get enough sleep? I think maybe interesting additions to that question are, when you do sleep, do you feel like it's good sleep? What keeps you awake and why? And how do you feel when you don't get enough sleep? How do you know that you need to sleep more? When do you feel safe sleeping? When do you want to sleep? I think there's so many questions that are really revealing about the way when we consider our needs and when we express how we feel about our needs, that's a really deep conversation, even if it doesn't feel like it. It's a very real thing to say, well, what are my basic requirements for life?
Mm-hmm.
And to engage with that with a teen as a parent, that's really, really important to say like, hey, I want to know about you and how do you assess what you need? And then how can I help give that to you more?
All right, final thing this week. The Biden administration passed a bill that would ban TikTok from the United States unless they divested themselves from the Chinese-owned parent company ByteDance, as well as a bill that gave Israel $26 billion in aid and $1 billion in humanitarian aid to Palestinians. So, two very different things happened here.
The TikTok ban was an earmark, basically. It was like an addendum, which a lot of people have talked about how, hey, it kind of feels like they're trying to rush this out. And so they're tying it into something like, hey, we need to send more aid to Ukraine and
to Israel.
Yeah, well, Ukraine too. It's all in the same bill. There's Ukraine stuff.
Yeah.
There's Israel stuff, and there's Gaza stuff.
Yeah.
And there's stuff to help like the humanitarian crisis that is happening in Gaza. But then it's also military stuff, and it's all.
And let's ban TikTok.
It's all wrapped up in there, and it made me realize. I don't know if you wanted to. Did you feel like you had covered?
I was going to kick it to you pretty quickly.
I think the first thing that this made me realize is how much young people have to be and are, but I think have to be is maybe the key word, aware of the global news cycle, like what's happening in the world, right? And a lot of the conversation around this stuff is there's been a lot of protests across college campuses around what's happening in Gaza, and a lot of arrests have happened. Like if you scroll the AP article we linked, it's just basically lists of amount of students who have been arrested at protests at different college campuses. The TikTok side of things, I think, is also very, very interesting, and it sounds almost ridiculous to say, but affects teens a lot too, right? It's, like you talk about stuff that's happening in Gaza, and then you're like, but the TikTok ban, that's hurting teens. It's like, it's okay. Yeah, it's complicated. I think Kate quoted a thing that was like, I want TikTok to die, but maybe naturally instead of unnaturally.
Oh, yeah, that was Bonnie Christian.
Yeah,
Writes, I think she's an ideas columnist for Christianity Today. But she's like, but she said in her private newsletter, I want TikTok to die a natural death.
Yeah, which I think there's like a weird tension here where it's like a lot of parents are like, yay, TikTok being banned, but also, yay, TikTok being banned? Because there's First Amendment stuff with that. It's all very complicated. My question for you all is, did you know that you have to, you cannot own a foreign power cannot own a radio station in America? There's like all these things wrapped up that I've been learning about as I've been studying this, that there's some genuine fears about China being able to influence what the next generation, what Gen Alpha and what Gen Z sees across their social media feeds. And for a long time, like our founding fathers put it into, they were afraid of foreign governments being able to influence at the time the very weak, the very new, the very young United States of America. And so we have a lot of that stuff. So to run a news organization in the US, you have to be in the US, which is crazy to think about. And I didn't realize this. And then you think, oh, social media, you don't have to have that. Oh, that's very interesting. And so there's very real, very logical arguments for, hey, ByteDance needs to sell TikTok if it's going to be as big as it is. But also, we live in a globalized world. So it's complicated because you have a lot of students who love TikTok and want to use it. You have a lot of students who make money off of TikTok, who that's part of their livelihood. You have a lot of students who say, hey, I get all of my news from TikTok. And I think that's some of the fears. Yeah. And there's also this like, hey, trust us that Congress is doing, where they're like, you haven't seen the data we've seen about TikTok. And it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Can we see the data?
Yeah, but then
the answer is probably no.
The whole other conversation that there's a guy, Khalil Green, who on TikTok goes by the Gen Z historian. Yeah. And he was pointing out that there's a core hypocrisy to the Biden administration supporting the TikTok ban while using it for their own
Absolutely.
campaign,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like, okay, if it really is such a big security risk, like of all people, maybe you guys shouldn't be on it.
For sure. And just to be clear, like, I think a lot of really smart people have said this, and so I'm just stealing what they said a little bit. But TikTok being sold to an American company will not make TikTok better for high schoolers, just to be clear.
Yeah,
like, it will
yeah,
still
right.
be unhealthy for them.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's this really just dynamite quote that I sent to Kate, and we were chatting about it yesterday. And basically the quote says, hey, if it's influencing elections and things this much, is there anyone, even American company, that we trust to have this power to? Like, if it's like, yes, we don't want a authoritarian kind of very strict government like the Communist Party in China to have this power over American public. But do we want Microsoft to have that power?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, Meta said,
yeah.
we don't care about kids. Not in so many words, but
yeah.
And that's the other big wrinkle, which I've talked about on the podcast before, is who do you get to buy TikTok? This is $100 billion corporation. And I'll compare it again. When Microsoft decided to buy Activision, King, and Blizzard, so King makes mobile games, Activision, Blizzard makes a lot of very popular video games. They spent $70 billion to do that. It took them about 3 years to get that approved because of trust busting, like monopoly fears about the game space, where there are other large players like Sony, like Nintendo, like a lot of other organizations. You talk about social media, the only companies big enough to buy TikTok are Microsoft, maybe Meta, right? And we saw how that went with X and Twitter and Elon, right? Like, do you want an individual to buy TikTok? Because that hasn't... I would argue it hasn't been the greatest situation.
I was just say, what if we made Elon buy TikTok and then he'll kill it too, like he killed Twitter?
Yeah,
That's
so
the
this
plan.
is pretty controversial because some people,
That's true. I just said a hot take that we're not going to discuss.
Well, and I think a lot of the argument is like social media is a public forum. But the issue with that statement is that public forums are owned by the people, like an actual public square is owned by the collective, and Twitter is not, right? It's owned by Elon Musk and his team. And Microsoft is owned by shareholders, and they have ideas of what they want to happen. And it's not necessarily like we decide as a group what's good. And there's arguments whether that's actually worthwhile, or like, will people know what's good for them? Because we all use TikTok anyway, and it's not good for us. So maybe we don't know what's good for us. But I think a lot of the conversation around this is with students is, I think it's hard for them to understand, I would argue, why this is happening, because it's really dense. Like, even for me, just learning that foreign powers cannot run news stations in the United States. It's like, that makes a lot of sense, because you don't want them influencing the way that the US works out. You want that to be an internal thing. But also, how does that relate to social media? And that's like, and then there's the whole First Amendment argument.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, even before the social media conversation, there's like the tension of that no foreign power can run a radio station or whatever the modern day equivalent would be, versus the First Amendment thing and the right to free.
Because TikTok is a
expression.
platform for free speech for a lot of, let's just say it, teens.
Yeah.
Like, it is. And it's where they create culture. And so if you get rid of that in the United States, and I mean, obviously, if they can divest within 12 months is the longest period of time they have. It's like 9 months, and they can file for 3 more months.
If they're in the process of a sale, it's like 3 more month thing.
Well, and it's very convoluted, because you've got kind of 3 layers. You have the understanding of the laws provided by professionals to lawmakers, which the average American citizen does not have a professional explaining the ins and outs of the American legal system in all its forms to help them make decisions. Also, we don't have that power. And then I always think it's interesting when we say things like, well, we have to judge this by the First Amendment, because that is an essential part of our Constitution. And it was written several centuries ago. If I went back and I was like, hey, George Washington, guess what? What do you think about this app on this magic box where kids are dancing to Nicki Minaj? He'd be like, a woman wearing pants? What's going on? He would be distracted. So we're trying to create boundaries with laws that were made for technology that the people who made the laws would think is witchcraft.
Well, I would argue that there's like an impressive amount of foresight in this idea of, hey, we're a young country that is very vulnerable to, let's say, France's influence, right? France helped the United States win the Revolutionary War. Like, we wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War without France's influence. Statue of Liberty kind of proves that, and it's like the relationship between France and the United States and the rise of democracy at that time, obviously the French Revolution. Not a great moment in American or in world history, but also a very important moment in world history in terms of what happened. And so the United States was worried about France stepping in and being like, well, we're just going to make you a puppet state, basically. And so they put a lot of things into the Constitution that protected against foreign influence. And that stuff still applies. And that's, I would argue that
I would actually say that our founding fathers understood the way that oligarchies work.
Yeah.
And that this is kind of an example of ways in which our current government system resembles an oligarchy. And that's why those things fit together. I do think, too, that the average teenager is probably under the impression that, yeah, of course, the United States wants to own TikTok. They don't want, or I guess a United States-based company to own TikTok because they don't want China to have the data. They want to have the data. Like, there's this implicit understanding that I think most teenagers have, which is that the United States wants to force this sale so that they have access to the TikTok data the way that the United States government already has access to Facebook data, Instagram data, Snapchat data, and the like. Like, there's this understanding that, like, the United States wants to have complete autonomous knowledge of online activities, and that this is a way that they can expand their data owning empire. That is an idea I have seen everywhere. So I agree that maybe teenagers don't understand the precedent. They don't understand that this is not unheard of in the history of the United States. But I think they're also kind of keen on this idea of, like, you know, the United States is oppressing us and they are supporting things we don't support. And that's kind of how we presented it in the Culture Translator, like what's going to happen now in terms of the Biden administration and the support that they had, the groundswell of support amongst Gen Z.
Yeah, I think there's a temptation to just assume, and like I think a lot of social media kind of cherry picks these moments. Like there was a congressman who's convinced that the guy who owns TikTok was from China, but he's Singaporean, which is very different. And they're not the same country. And he's just like very confused in that moment. And a lot of like young people will use that and say, look, Congress is like super out of touch. And I think it's interesting that I'm landing here, but I think part of what I've been learning is like, actually, there are some decent reasons our lawmakers are deciding to make this choice. And it's not just, well, they don't understand how technology works. Cause like, I think the perception for young people is that, man, everyone who are the people who are pulling the levers of power in the United States are all 70 and older, and they do not understand how we use the internet, and they don't understand it. But the reality is, I think there are some genuine reasons why you would say, hey, we don't want TikTok in our country the way it is right now. Now, that's, I think, the thing that will come up is when the conversations is because I think young people will have a different perspective than older people. And I think that's between parents and teens as well, and parents and their teens. So that might be part of that conversation. I think it's pretty easy to angle this conversation in a way that's like, hey, do you think our world would be better without a TikTok or worse without a TikTok? And that, I would argue, that sometimes separates it from the political angle. And so if you want to talk about the political side of things, you can. But I think if you're going to ask a question, I think that's a question you could ask.
Yeah,
like,
that's good.
Hey, do you think the world would be better without TikTok or worse without TikTok? Because that gets them into thinking about what life would be like without a specific social media and if it's actually helpful for them. Obviously, don't ask the question to manipulate them into that answer, because they might say, I think the world would be much worse without TikTok because it's super entertaining and a lot of fun, and, you know, and I connect with my friends on it or whatever it is, you know. But I think that's a question you could ask. I think you could also ask a question about, do you feel affected by things that are happening outside of our country? And that applies maybe more to the Israel-Gaza situation. But I think that's something we should be asking, because I think even people who are like 50, 60, 70 years old, the world has changed so much in terms of globalization and being aware of what other people live like and what is happening in other countries, that it was like, you would read it in the newspaper, or maybe you would turn on the news at night and see, hey, there's something happening in Syria or whatever it is, But now it's like 24/7, you can just go access it. You can search it and say, what is happening in Syria? What is happening in Africa? And you can, and there's horrible things happening around the world for sure. And so students often take that on themselves and they say, oh, well, everything's awful. And there's always been evil in the world, but there's always been good too. And so I think that it's helpful to help frame that for students. So those are my two questions. Do you think the world is a better place without TikTok or worse? And do you feel like you're affected by the things that are happening around the world?
Thanks for watching this week's Culture Translator Roundtable podcast. Because of our generous community of donors, Access is able to make all of our resources available for free. So if you've been impacted by what we do, please take a minute to help us get the word out by sharing this podcast or simply giving it a like. Also, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss out on any of our new resources. Thank you.